I think it is fair to say that few federal authorization bills brings as much interest and debate as the upcoming transportation authorization bill. This authorization bill faces both fiscal and philosophical hurdles. There is always the age-old funding battles between lawmakers representing states that contribute more to the Federal Highway Trust Fund than they get, and those who get back more than they contribute. But now we also have, I think, the Obama administration's new political and policy priorities that include heightened interest in climate change, making transportation sector greener at the same time when gas receipts are lower. To help us sort out these issues, we have three experts from the Washington area who are going to explain to us guys and gals up here in the Northeast how we may deal with these upcoming issues. You have their impressive bios in front of you, as you have everybody's bios, but let me just take a second and quickly review for you the three people who are going to present to you. Jack Basso is the CEO and Director of Management and Business Development for the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, the organization that represents the interests of state departments of transportation. And prior to that position, he was the Assistant Secretary for Budget and Programs and the CFO of the United States Department of Transportation. Ann Canby is the President of the Surface Transportation Policy Partnership and National Advocacy Coalition for Transportation Reforms. And among her previous positions, Ann served as the Transportation Commissioner here in New Jersey. I even go back that far in the Byrne administration. And also the Transportation Commissioner in Delaware. And finally, Bob Puentes, Rob, is the Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he directs their Metropolitan Infrastructure Program. And prior to that position, Rob was the Director of Infrastructure Programs at the Intelligent Transportation Society of America. So we're going to start with Jack. Welcome, Jack. You know how to get this thing rolling here?
It should be used slideshow. It's a move. Well, good morning to all of you, and let me particularly thank Rich Keevey and the folks here for inviting me. Let me acknowledge Commissioner Glenn and our new commissioner from New Jersey, who are members of our organization. Whenever you go anywhere, it's really good to acknowledge your members. You know, they pay dues, and it's really important that they do. Commissioner Glenn, in particular, is the chair of our Rail Committee and is moving us forward substantially in that regard. Mort Downey, obviously, he and I know what we did in the transition, but we'll never be able to tell anybody. But it was interesting, I must say, so I'll leave it at that with that regard. Beyond that, it really is a critical time in the history of surface transportation. I think about this. I've been in this business now about 45 years. Started at 15, so you can figure it all out, you know, from there, but not a little older maybe. Anyway, I didn't go back to the beginnings of the interstate system, but that was a period of time when people actually came to a vision, came to a simplistic way to explain that to the public and sell it and make it happen. We are probably, in my mind, at the same threshold that the folks that dealt with those issues were at that point in time. And we're very much at a crossroads, and I'm reminded of Robert Frost's admonition about the road not taken. So I would hope that we are not seen as a people who found their way to get to the road not taken. So let me move along here and just mention a few objectives for this session. I want to provide you with some information and an overview of AASHTO's proposals for authorization, which I think are actually very broad-based and actually a departure, frankly, from past policy positions the organization has taken. I want to talk a little bit about the resources that are necessary and how we might get them to implement that new vision, and then, to the extent I have a little bit of time, be able to answer some of your questions. We are clearly at the point of needing a restructured 21st century set of programs for transportation. Not a cliche, a set of facts. Not a sermon, just a thought. Think about that a little bit. With regard to ASH, though, I think one of the things that informed us greatly was the work of the National Surface Transportation Policy and Revenue Study Commission, which reported about a little over a year ago on their findings, and they came to the conclusion that the federal programs needed to be consolidated, reformed to address the objectives today, and be in the genuine national interest moving forward. And we support that idea, and the things that we put forward as policy proposals from our board of directors really addresses itself to much of the work of the Commission, and most recently on financing, a new National Finance Commission reported about a week ago on their views on this. So, what are some of the key assumptions that we are intertwined with? First, the ability to flex highway funds to transit and vice versa, and perhaps even with the current stimulus bill to be even more broad-based in terms of interchangeability and intermodal objectives, is paramount to the future of transportation. The planning process that looks first at mobility after weighing alternatives then decides which modal improvement is best, highways, transit, rail, etc., is the critical factor, the critical ingredient that will move us forward in this 21st century restructuring. We need to maintain eligibility of previously established programs to invest through the Highway Trust Fund resources in freight rail. Freight rail becomes an important part of this. Some additional key assumptions. We need to restore to about 90% the portion of federal highway program funding that is apportioned by formula to the states. One of the things that I think is a critical failure of SAFETEA-LU was the fact if you do the calculations, you'll get a little different answer depending on how you do them, but somewhere around 20% of the funding in SAFETEA-LU is earmarked to projects, which, as we all know in Washington, we know much better what to do than any of you do, so we make those decisions for you. An absolute ridiculous abomination, frankly. And what we propose to deal with in that formula program with 90% of the money is to provide a highway program that has a minimum of $375 billion over 6 years. And I'll show you a little bit of what the structure would support if we actually did that. And we need to ensure that the funding that is necessary to restore purchasing power is handled in here, because we have lost dramatically purchasing power since we haven't done anything at the federal level to increase dedicated revenue since 1993. With regard to the structure of the program, you've got to give some definition, and we are looking for a preservation and renewal program that will focus very strategically on needs, freight programs that deal with both freight rail and passenger rail effectively, a highway safety improvement program that allows us to stop killing 43,000 people on our highways each year, and an operations and management program that will improve and increase the efficiency of our systems, and congestion reduction programs that address the needs of our urban areas, and environmental programs that deal with air quality and climate change. This is a lot to swallow. We need to add about $28 billion for preservation, including reconstruction and expansion. We need maximum flexibility, which I've already mentioned. We need the ability to transfer funds. We need people in the state and local areas to be able to make those decisions. And we are suggesting the subcomponents of that are interstate preservation, national highway system preservation, and bridge preservation. I don't think anybody has to think a lot about the bridge program and the difficulties we experienced recently with that. Freight programs, and I'll talk about two parts of that very briefly. In the apportioned and discretionary programs coming from the Highway Trust Fund, we want to put somewhere in the range of $18 billion in that, $5 billion apportioned, $2 billion discretionary, to deal with intermodal access to ports, international gateway improvements, truck corridors, and develop truck-only lanes. With regard to highway safety, we think we should be spending about $2.6 billion, and railroad grade crossings are part of that. Operation Lifesaver, a rail safety program, high-risk rural road set-asides, and continuing funding for Safe Route School are part of that program. $3 billion to improve the performance of both rural and urban areas and encourage but not require the use of funds for low-cost, quick turnaround improvements. Let people make decisions and know what the right ones are. Improvements in congestion, $11 billion to urban areas, divided up in those urban areas, and also providing for statewide connectivity that creates, if you will, the opportunity to integrate more effectively. With regard to reductions that affect non-urban areas, we recognize that there needs to be throughout the country, in the more rural areas of the country, non-urban areas, opportunities for increased investment. The environmental programs, we would look to put $3.4 billion in that, 50% dealing with ozone and other issues, 50% to climate change, and in non-attainment areas also, in areas that are not non-attainment areas, to be able to provide some funding for much-needed projects. All of this has to come with a particular ingredient or something the public will grasp and consider important, and that is refocusing the program on the national interest and setting performance measures for preservation, for freight, for system operations, and the things that I've mentioned previously. The restructuring of the programs, I've taken you through that, and we have suggested these areas that you see on the screen for that purpose. Transit programs should certainly have high priority and be revised accordingly to meet its needs. We need to establish the national goals that really are called out: safety, preservation, congestion, operation, freight, environment. We need to develop a state-driven performance measurement system. We need to clearly account for what's done, demonstrate its effectiveness, bring that to the public, bring it to lawmakers, and really focus on the fact that money is important, but it's secondary to the importance of what money does. And there are several ways to go about that, but we've suggested a system where the states would be required by federal law to develop performance measures. Those performance measures would be approved at the federal and state level and reported on regularly. I'm going to skip over a couple of things here and get to these important goals. Why do this? We need to enhance economic competitiveness in interstate commerce, national defense, through an enhanced freight system. We need to reduce congestion, improve urban and rural area accessibility through effective transportation solutions, and we need to support system reliability for national security and national disaster response. We have good reasons to do these things. We need dedicated funding source for intercity passenger rail. One of the things the stimulus bill did was bring a substantial focus on rail, high-speed rail, $8.5 billion, substantial money for further funding of Amtrak, but we need to focus coherently and cohesively on our passenger rail system. Capital program for the states, we're looking for an 80-20 kind of program and looking for ways to put in the range of $5 billion annually into those freight programs and into those rail programs. I'm going to skip over a few things for the sake of giving my colleagues a chance to have their say, but let me mention some things about funding, because at the end of the day, we have to have resources for this. The federal government must continue a strong role in investing and maintaining an integrated multimodal national surface transportation system. I think previous administration, if I'm critical of anything, it's the unwillingness to recognize the need to do this singular thing as being very important. States and local governments have to have maximum flexibility to be able to use federal revenues in the best possible way. And most importantly, for the public and for everyone else concerned, is strong accountability measures. We are going nowhere unless we account properly to the public for what we do. We need to restore purchasing power. I mentioned this. We have some graphics that suggest from 1993, the last time we raised the fuel tax at the federal level, to 2015, the purchasing power of that 18.4 cents a gallon will decline 80%, be able to buy 20% of what we could in 1993. That's a critical issue. Safety and research need to be critical parts of this effort The impact of inflation on commodities and construction costs must be addressed. With regard to legislative recommendations, we're looking to invest in robust programs that address highways, transit, freight, passenger rail, to the tune of $545 billion over 6 years. I mentioned $375 billion for highways, $93 billion at a minimum for transit, freight, $42 billion, both between the Highway Trust Fund and other dedicated sources of revenue, intercity passenger rail, $35 billion. We need to maintain the current federal-state relationship and investment, which in capital programs is about a 45% federal split, 55% state. We think we need to do something about revenue adjustments, so we've suggested creating a commission to recommend to Congress periodic adjustments outside the glare of politics. We want to adopt a long-range approach to funding for surface transportation system that gradually moves away from our dependence on the current gas tax to other methods such as a VMT system, and assume that climate change legislation creates new revenue sources and opportunities to address these issues. This chart simply gives you a summary of that $545 billion. This last chart, which is extremely busy, shows that you can generate up to $1.3 trillion in revenue from a whole variety of sources. It is kind of the ultimate menu of everything you can think of, but it makes the point that we need somewhere around $450 billion in revenue, and there is 3 times that capacity just in some of the thoughts we've had, and I'm sure other people can have equal or better thoughts. So with that having been said, the last point I'd like to make is that we are at a crossroads. We are the people who have the opportunity to do what they did in 1956 and make a visionary difference. We're the people who also have the opportunity to not be able to come together and not step up and actually succeed at that goal, leaving 30 years from now our children and grandchildren to look at us either as the visionaries who put them on the course for a bright future or those who really failed to accomplish that objective. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's great to be back here as a former commissioner, and my friends out there in the audience, it's great to see you, and my panelists. And Rich, thanks for organizing it. These discussions need to happen all over the United States, and I'm not sure if they will in the next year or so, but let's try and make this something that becomes commonplace in regions all over the country. And Mort, it's great to have you here today. I got into the transportation business sitting at Mort's knee, sucking in as much as my little brain could absorb from his huge one. Jack and I were laughing at dinner last night. We thought he, back in those days, carried around a major computer just to store all the information that seems to never go out of his head. He's absolutely extraordinary. Well, and my friend Astrid, who we hope to work with a lot on rail issues as we go forward. Well, here we are with another authorization, and there are a growing number of proposals for how we might approach this one. I think Jack is absolutely right. This is a time for critical reexamination of these programs. And so we're in this game, and everybody's putting their proposals on the table. So pretty much right now, this is déjà vu. This is what tends to happen. But change is clearly in the air, and I don't think we all have absorbed quite exactly what that means just yet. We have a new president, a new transportation secretary, a very different and uncertain economic landscape, clearly a commitment like none we have seen in the past to climate and energy issues. And I just picked up in email traffic last night that the Senate, anyway, is going to try and move a combined energy and climate bill this year, putting it ahead probably of a transportation bill. And challenges that everybody has and will talk about in terms of how do we raise enough money for infrastructure. The Economic Recovery Act is clearly a step to put more money on the table, $50 billion. And that's not chump change, not clearly enough ever, but there's some new things in there that hopefully can begin to set the stage for thinking about how we go forward. The $8 billion for high-speed rail and the state rail program and rail congestion, I think, was a bit of a surprise to many of us. We'll see how the Department of Transportation actually figures out how to allocate among those three potential uses and the many users that are out there. The $1.5 billion discretionary program, which will be nowhere near enough to all the applications that are going to be submitted for that, I'm quite sure. And for the first time, direct eligibility of funds that flow to the states for rail investment, passenger or freight, explicit words in the language. And I think there's a mixed picture right now in terms of how enthusiastic the states are in terms of picking up on that new eligibility. But we'll see if we can't ramp up the attention to that part of it, because it's clearly a piece of our future. The approach we have today is very stovepiped. We all have separate modal sources of money, and everyone is sort of what's mine is mine, and even though there's a lot of flexibility, sharing is not something that's done with great joy or enthusiasm or frequency, I might say. But we need to find some ways to get past that very, very much, so that we can do the cross-modal trade-off examination as Jack suggested. But there are institutional, financial, programmatic, and procedural barriers that I think we ought to look at as we go forward with this legislation. How do we deal with intercity travel, and how do we bring all the players into that game in a way that is acceptable to work together, that gets beyond just a number of states looking at highway corridors or a number of states looking at rail in a particular region, to really be thinking about intercity trips and international gateways that are very important to our economy. At the regional level, clearly it's ripe for much thinking and some overhaul. And even at the local level, because we have neglected that part of the system which pushes trips up onto the regional network. In some places we have too few choices in terms of how to get around at the local level. So I think that becomes a national interest as well. I want to talk briefly about four things. The national interest, and how do we embed that in the law, and what might we think about, decision-making, planning, and obviously the money part of it. Creating at the national level a strong federal program has a lot of different implications depending on where you sit. And you'll hear some similarities between what I'm sure the three of us will say, and probably Mort at lunch as well. But there's some things where there is, I think, no disagreement about safety and improving operating efficiency and whatnot. That's, to me, sort of inside baseball. How do we move outside the traditional comfort zone that the transportation community has lived in for ever so long, to think about the issues of the connectivity of our nation's economy to the rest of the world and the implications for transportation, that truly commits to embracing climate issues, the challenge of global warming, and the energy as part of the basic transportation mission, and also how to provide more effective set of travel options for both people and for businesses who create the jobs that we all depend on. So in our view, a national program really needs to have clear national goals. But along with that comes accountability. And right now there is basically, it's an accountability-free zone, this set of programs that we have today, making the U.S. DOT accountable for national objectives, and in turn creating accountability to grantees. There is a small set of words in the language in Title 23, which is the highway title, that I think we need to pay attention to and probably rethink what the relationship means. And it says, the provisions of this chapter, referring to Title 23, provide for a federally assisted state program. Jack's colleagues, I mentioned this at a meeting last week, they probably think, oh, there she goes again, crazy once more. But it undermines the ability of the federal agency to have any accountability, because they just become a money funneling agency to give money to whoever the grant recipients may be. So this relationship, I believe, needs to be rethought and restructured. If states receive federal money, then there is a responsibility to deliver against a set of clearly defined national objectives. My mother used to say, you live in my house, you play by my rules, so I moved out, you know? Eventually I moved out, but there is some connection here. If you're taking federal dollars, there is some responsibility to deliver against a national set of objectives. The president is certainly talking about accountability when it comes to the economic recovery money, and all the recipients are going to be very much under the magnifying glass to see how that plays out. So accountability, I think, is also very much in the conversation that we're having today, and finding ways to address that become very important. We now put money out based on how many miles we drive and how many lane miles we have and whatnot, so there's really not, it's all based on using more, so maybe we need to look at the factors that distribute the funding, creating some incentive programs that reward good behavior and maybe restrict funding in places that are falling behind achieving national objectives might be some way to make some changes to build more accountability into it. We got to move out of the donor-donee mindset. That will be very difficult, coming from a major donee state. But we need to do that, because otherwise you can't have a set of objectives that really are based on the outcomes we're trying to achieve. The decision-making arena is one I have talked about over the years, but right now with the challenges that we face, one could question whether the institutional construct that we have today would work for the challenges that we need to address. And clearly in a major metropolitan area like the one you're dealing with in the northern part of the state and the one you deal with in the southern part of your state here, thinking about how we can be more integrated in bringing together all the players and having a broader decision-making authority, more distributed authority, and also bringing in the private sector, because clearly there are a number of private sector players in the transportation arena that we need to engage in these discussions. We're sort of short on institutional models in this regard, and there needs to be a lot more thought and discussion amongst players who might not initially agree to see if we can't find some common ground to build better decision-making structures than what we have in place today. And local governments really don't bear any responsibility for the transportation difficulties that they may create as they make their land use decisions, and vice versa. Transportation agencies don't always reflect accountability for the complications they create for local communities. So there's a lot of interaction that needs to happen, and discussion, and a building of trust, and a nature of a relationship that can then open the way for more change and a much more integrated decision-making process. We have metropolitan planning organizations. Joel is here from NMTIC, and how do we really build the credibility for those entities, both at the level that they operate at in their regions, but also at the national level, where frankly they do not have as much credibility as the state transportation agencies or the transit agencies, who are the other two major players. So we need to figure that out. In the planning arena, I would suggest, as Jack did, that we need to make a much stronger planning process. We may not agree on quite what we mean, what each of us means when we say that, but from our view, in planning, I have always thought we like building better than we like planning, because building produces more tangible results. But if we have a vision, if we don't have a vision, it's sort of hard to know whether we've realized it. And so a plan really should be the basis for how we form and frame our investment decisions, rather than focusing so much on specific projects. What are the outcomes? And the plan should be the home for not only the vision, but the baselines, what we're trying to accomplish, and then measuring whether or not we did. And it should be the document around which we're held accountable for delivering the results that folks have spoken about earlier this morning. And I think in the planning language, there is plenty to work with and to strengthen and to improve upon in current law already. Some other areas that merit some discussion is the law explicitly excludes the long-range transportation plans from being subject to NEPA. Maybe we ought to change that so that, in fact, it is subject to NEPA, the plan, and then you can reduce what you have to look at when you're doing a specific project. If you have answered some of the major questions at the planning stage, at the real planning stage, not the project planning stage, we can then narrow what we look at when we get to a project. That is a very contentious idea, but one that I believe needs to be put on the table and given some real effort to make it happen. Another area which is completely nonsensical based on the program structure that we have today. We have completely different analytical process depending on if you're going to add highway capacity or if you're going to add transit capacity. That is nuts, insane, stupid, and I need not say more. Can't we come up with a single analytical process, no matter what kind of capacity you're trying to add, that really looks at the trade-offs and the benefits and not for whatever the investment may be across a broader range of challenges and issues that we need to face. Finally, let me touch on funding. This may be the mother of all challenges. Clearly, we've seen opening salvos, hopefully not permanent, from the new administration. No VMT tax, no gas tax. What does this mean? I'm not sure. We can say for sure they're never going to do this, but in the turmoil of the beginning of administration, you know, interesting things come out from White Houses and offices of management and budget. We remember some messages that we got from our White House that were a little appalling, we thought. But they tend to maybe hopefully work their way through. But clearly this is going to be a major, major issue. And from our standpoint, new revenues have to come with some real changes to the program structure, the insertion of real national objectives and outcomes, and some accountability in the program. Otherwise, we will fall back on more of the same and expecting different results when it will really not be possible to achieve them. And also, we're looking at where in the government structure do we assess these revenues? I mean, there's a lot of talk about tolling now, but that's not going to be federal revenue. Value capture on transit investments, that's not likely to produce federal revenue. So what is the essential question that we need to be asking? One to my mind is, what are the problems we're trying to solve? And do we picture and portray them in a way that the public can really understand what some of the challenges are and how they live their lives, rather than just saying we need more to keep on doing what we've been doing? I think this is a big challenge in the funding discussion. We've never really made any connection between the costs of transportation and the price that people pay, and driving has therefore been somewhat unconstrained. As I said before, mode-specific funding, which keeps us from looking at the way we should across modes. The user pay system has been a basic fundamental foundation. It is clearly fraying more than at the edges, I would say, at this point. And so figuring out what the basis ought to be for funding is going to be a critical piece as well. Pricing signals clearly probably need to be inserted into this. Demand management in ways that will get us to rethink some of our priorities for transportation investment. We're already, in terms of user fee, the $8 billion that we used to support the Highway Trust Fund last fall, and then this almost $50 billion of economic recovery money, none of that is user fees. And so we're sort of beyond the edge of keeping the sanctity of the trust fund as it is, although people are ignoring it for the moment, but that will raise its head up at some point. The infrastructure bank idea, clearly one that needs to be more thought through and discussed with everybody. But where do we find? Is it a value-added tax? Does it come from the climate resources? If so, what does that money go for? Where do we get funding? And how do we sort of parcel this out amongst the various levels of government? And bringing rail into the picture, I think, from both a funding standpoint as well as a systems approach standpoint, will be absolutely critical. The more rail we can do, we save wear and tear on the roadway. Someone else is paying for the right-of-way maintenance, and there can be huge benefits by new partnership. And I think in terms of the public-private partnership, within the transportation community, we have barely scratched the surface on the opportunities to link public and private capital within the transportation community itself. And I think there are lots of opportunities to probe further in that. So let me just wrap up by asking a few questions. Are we ready to really rethink the basic transportation mission, to lay out a set of federal goals and to hold ourselves accountable for meeting them, to broaden the decision-making apparatus so we have more owners at more levels of government, to strengthen the planning process, and to put together a satisfactory, multimodal, unified transportation funding mechanism as we go forward? Those are some questions that I think we could spend a lot of time discussing. Thank you very much.
Wouldn't be from Washington if I didn't bring the PowerPoint presentation. While we're getting that going, I want to just thank you very much. Thank Rich and his team for the invitation to have me here today. My name is Robert Puentes from the Brookings Institution in Washington. I am from New Jersey. I spent all my life growing up here. I'm from Hudson County, so of course I never set a foot in Princeton until recently. So. But I do appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's a little intimidating following Jack and Ann, given all their experience and knowledge and what they've done and thought about, particularly as this issue gets much more attention on the national level today. I think that it's not hyperbole to say that it's been moved off the back burner of the American policy discourse, maybe not to the front burner yet, but I think it's not an issue that's relegated to the back rooms and boardrooms of the highway establishment or the transportation insiders anymore. It really is something that's been put on the front pages of the papers every day. And we do appreciate, I think, the attention to this issue, particularly using infrastructure to stimulate the national economy. It may not be as much as some had wanted. We took a very broad kind of analysis of what was in the recovery package. We found there's about $152 billion in infrastructure writ large, not just for transportation, but for infrastructure all across the board. And I do think that that's a good step. I do think that that's the right approach in trying to help this nation recover from its economic problems. We do believe that infrastructure is a critical asset, and that maximizing this asset, again, transportation and infrastructure writ large, really is one of the key things that's going to help this nation deal with the historic challenges that it has today: economic, environment, and the social imperatives. But what I want to talk about today is where we find these central assets. Because the one thing that we know is that we have this conversation nationally is that they don't exist in the abstract, nor are they distributed evenly across the landscape of this nation or any other nation, but they really do coalesce, combine, and really take shape within our major metropolitan areas from coast to coast. So what I want to do is talk about metropolitan areas, how important they are, and the role of metros in this larger conversation. Our country's top 100 metros, as you can see from the chart, only take up about 12% of the American land mass. It's about 2/3 of the population, but it's where 3/4 of the GDP is produced. It's where a lion's share of the real estate value is, where the knowledge economy jobs is, where immigrants are going. These really are our economic engines of our country. If we're talking about the economic recovery of our country, we should be focusing on these places, which really are our economic engines. And when it comes to transportation, we look at almost every single transportation indicator that you can think of. All of these are disproportionately higher in the country's top 100 metros, whether it's seaport tonnage, air passengers, interstate miles traveled, almost all of the transit riders, all of these things. I think intuitively we understand this, but when you break it down, it really is hyper-concentrated and highly concentrated in these top 100 metropolitan areas. And I do think that there is more attention that's being given to metropolitan decision-making today. All these issues seem to be emerging all across the landscape. I think there's broad understanding of the regional context of issues like transportation, but also land use, environmental issues, our demographic dynamics, major changes in all of these issues, really churning mostly in these major metropolitan areas. As Ann mentioned, although they do have an uneven track record of success, we do have metropolitan planning organizations that do exist. They do remain these ubiquitous metropolitan agents all across the country. And we know that other civic, corporate, philanthropic, political leaders are starting to recognize metros as our nation's metropolitan, our economic engines. The problem when it comes to the federal transportation program is that the structural problems that Ann and Jack had already clearly articulated is that the federal program, when it relates to transportation, is inhibiting the optimization of these metropolitan areas and their ability to deliver on these promises for the 21st century. For one thing, we know that the federal government, as has been talked about, is absent. I really probably need to update that slide because we know that they do need Washington much more than ever. But the point remains. I think for transportation, as was talked about, there really isn't any kind of national vision, goals, leadership, or direction on the federal level. As Ann mentioned, it's really kind of a process for sending money out to the states without any kind of leadership or direction on the federal level. The second thing is that the federal government also is outdated and fails to recognize the primacy of metropolitan areas. There's a whole bunch of ways that we need to update the program for the 21st century. It still is a program with its roots back in the 1950s. Ann talked a little bit about the unlevel playing field between highways and transit. A lot of folks drill in most directly onto the unlevel splits between an 80 or 90% share that's going to highways on the federal level and about a 49% or 47% share on the transit level. But Ann also talked about the unlevel rules that go into this. There's no rules really that dictate how the money is spent on the highway side on the federal level. Hyper-competitive, very bureaucratic process on the transit side. There's a lot of things that needs to be happening on the federal level to update it to the realities of today. The third critique is that the federal government is underperforming and, again, failing to maximize these efficiencies. We talked about the compartmentalization within the transportation program. We have a Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, Federal Railroad Administration. Rarely do these things link up, but we also don't link up things that everybody outside of Washington knows are fundamentally connected. Housing, transport, environment, land use, schools. All of these decisions are made by families all across America in a connected way, in a holistic way. It's only in the stovepipe world of Washington where these issues are kept separate, kept distinct, and not dealt with together. We also, as Ann mentioned, we don't really measure any of the spending for this program. We don't have any performance or accountability. All that goes into this critique about an underperforming federal system. So what I want to do just quickly then is walk through what's been happening. How are we thinking about metropolitan decision-making when it comes to transportation? What's happened in the past? What do we see as the prospects for the future? I think this really is a tipping point we're facing now when it comes to transportation on the metropolitan level. So what's gone right? There's been a number of things. This is not something that somebody from Brookings is just here kind of hyperventilating about today. This has been something that's gone on for a number of decades. 1962, in the Federal Highway Act, established that we start doing some of this planning for transportation programs, the 3 C's that we need to make sure that we're doing: comprehensive, cooperative, and continuing planning is still the framework that we're operating under today. Back in 1973, metropolitan areas were allocated direct money for the first time. And even though in the 1980s there was a direct loss of funding to these metros, it did force these metropolitan agencies to rethink what they were doing. They became much more entrepreneurial and started focusing on data collection, analysis, planning, and other kind of research. It was not until 1991 then, with the landmark ICE-T legislation, that it really changed the way that we think about metropolitan areas, metropolitan decision-making. I'll just quickly go through these. We gave MPOs the responsibility for the fiscally constrained plans, making sure that the planning wasn't just an aggregation of wish lists, but really had some basis in reality. It gave the MPOs the lead on major investment studies, deciding which improvement was right for which corridor. Established a certification process to make these metropolitan areas accountable, certain measures of economy, environment, and equity, and improve technical competencies. And then the legislation that has passed in recent years has kind of bumped that up a little bit, really kind of making sure that these places were equipped to deal with the problems of the future. I think, though, that when we look back at this experiment that began with ICE-T, it may be time for us to say, well, maybe this experiment has failed. And it really hasn't done what I think the framers and Senator Moynihan and his colleagues back in 1991 really set out to do. And there's a bunch of things that have gone wrong on all levels. Again, we talked about the federal critique by not holding its grantees accountable, by dismantling our information systems, by not being outcome-based, and not focusing on things like land use and making these connections, we really haven't optimized the ability of metropolitan areas to be very productive. On the state level, several things have gone wrong as well. Many still have not really embraced metropolitan decision-making. Sharing authority is something that's difficult for any institution to do. You see that happening on the state level as well. Collaborative relationships are difficult. We know that the states also tend to undermine spending in metropolitan areas. We have this donor and donee debate, which dominates the discussion on the federal level every year, and whether or not that logic should apply. We don't have that same kind of logic within states, and oftentimes we find when we look at where the spending is going that the metropolitan areas are often the donors and not receiving what they should from their states. And the different institutional interests also do create problems. But it's not just the state and the federal government. Clearly the local governments have dramatic interests, as Ann talked about. The parochial interests that exist on the local level still dominate. We still are having a hard time making metropolitan decisions or decisions about projects that are good for metros. We still see that there's an aggregation of a lot of local projects that are called metropolitan plans, and that's probably not the right approach. Truly linking transportation with land use is a challenge. Locals hold their prerogative for local land use decisions very, very tightly and are loath to give that up. And collaboration has just generally been very difficult on the local level. But there have also been problems on the metro level. It still kind of suffers from what my boss calls as kind of kumbaya regionalism. If we all just hold hands and say we're going to do things regionally, then all good things will happen. We really haven't seen that happen in many metropolitan areas. It's really just what they call soft regionalism. You know, when it behooves places to make decisions on a metro level, they'll do it, but it's really not, I think, what some folks were looking for. So then let me just wrap up quickly. Then, well, what do we need to do then? So talking about the federal bill, we have this opportunity, as Jack mentioned, we really are at a crossroads. How do we make sure that the next authorization does prioritize metropolitan areas and deals with some of the critiques I talked about? I think it really is about this three-pronged strategy that we've put together at Brookings. So what if we had a national transportation policy that really did support metropolitan areas? We think part of it is the federal government needs to focus, needs to prioritize, needs to become much more disciplined. I think the chairman talked about this earlier. The federal government needs to lead in those areas where only the federal government can lead. Because it's a big country, because some issues are just too big for states and metros to deal with by themselves, the federal government needs to focus on those issues where only the national government can lead. And part of that is clearly about establishing a bold national vision for this hundreds and hundreds of $billions in spending. Then they also need to empower metropolitan areas in the states to unleash all the innovation and the problem solving, and that's tailored to the individual realities in these individual places. We have to support metropolitan innovation. We'll talk about that in just a second. And they need to optimize, not just Washington's own performance, but that of its grantees in order to maximize metropolitan prosperity. Developing meaningful outcome goals and measuring progress towards meeting those goals is a critical thing that we need to do. So specifically, what would this be? In terms of leading, the federal government needs to focus on three things that are just broadly shared nationally. We need to protect the existing asset of the interstate system. It was created by a federal division 50 years ago. That system needs to be fixed. Clearly, that's a big national thing where the federal government should have some kind of focus. Intermodally, we absolutely need to focus on freight. We're one of the only industrialized countries in the world that doesn't have a comprehensive policy for freight movement. Goods come into the port of LA, Long Beach, they're put on trains, trucks, get stuck in Chicago, get sent somewhere else. So we absolutely need to have a national focus on freight movement. And then on intermetropolitan area passenger movement. As Ann talked about, we still have no plan for whether we're using rail or air or highways, or how do we get between our major metropolitan areas? Clearly the federal government can have a big role in that. But then there's some places where the federal government should really get out of the way and allow states and metropolitan areas to experiment. We need to remove the restrictions to market mechanisms. There's still some hesitation to embrace pricing as a real solution to some of our congestion problems. We need to level the modal playing field. Again, as we talked about, having highways, transit, rail, and all these modes operating under different rules, different funding matches, different regulations is intolerable for all the reasons that Ann mentioned. And we need to connect transportation to housing, land use, et cetera. On the federal level, this is something I think that we can easily do. We have all these different departments. They really should be working together to leverage their strengths where they possibly can. And finally, we need to optimize the whole system. We need to augment the accountability and reward performance, as Ann talked about. If you are doing good things, you should get more money from the federal government. We need to overhaul data and information. We should have a world-class data and information system. There's no reason this has to be a fact-free zone, as we talked about. And then we need to build a core of 21st century professionals. We know that there's a lot of people going to be retiring. We need to make sure that folks are equipped to deal with these realities of the future. So after then we talk about these reforms, which I know are a heavy lift, and we have no illusions about that, but after we talk about these reforms, that as far as funding goes, all options should be on the table. I think it's way too much premature to take options like the gas tax, the VMT tax, or any of these things off the table. We know that there's going to be a lot of contention and controversy that goes into just the reform idea. We shouldn't have these same kind of problems when it comes to really what are very rational, realistic, and appropriate responses on the funding side. So I want to thank Princeton. Thank you very much for having me here today. I appreciate the time. I look forward to your questions.
I need to get a hold of your charts. They're really pretty neat. We have 25 minutes or so for questions and answers on the authorization bill. If you would stand up and identify yourself, and we will get a mic to you. Dale is coming.
Hello. Hi, my name is Max Kind. I'm with New Jersey Economic Development Authority and the New Jersey Department of Labor. It's actually a great honor to be here. It's a breath of fresh air that today's presenters pointed out that we need to measure outcome-based. However, my question is, what are the outcomes we should be measuring? What kind of variables should we concern ourselves? Efficiency, green impact, or any other variables? Thank you.
Anybody?
Well, first of all, I think on measures, I think that is the key question, break the mold. And I think things such as impacts, not just in terms of basic engineering questions like do you have the right pavements, do you have the right locations, and so forth, are not what we need to focus on exclusively. Those things fit into a process, but I think we need to focus on smart growth. We need to look at measures that measure, are we using proper techniques for land use? Are we recognizing that throughout the country one size doesn't fit all in terms of achieving objectives? Are we willing to really do some things, for example, on safety that are very, very forceful and that some other countries have done to bring the rates of this kind of tragic carnage down to a point that's rational? It's never rational to lose lives, but 43,000 people a year is not rational and it's unacceptable. And we need to then, having created that accountability, actually do something with it. You know, the old saying, if you measure it, report it, nobody pays any attention to it, it's not of much value. There needs to be some real force back that says, if we're going to put resources into areas, we need to recognize that they do what they're supposed to do. If they don't, we need to put them somewhere else.
I would suggest, again, as I alluded to or tried to in my remarks, that we need to reach outside the transportation world and internalize some of the issues that are facing us, and climate and energy are two of the most important ones. Transportation is a huge player in both those arenas, and we have to be able to incorporate those issues into the basic transportation mission. And then we would have outcomes, and I don't know, they may come out of the energy and climate bills, or bill, depending on how the Congress handles it, where there is a cap on greenhouse gas emissions, or a vehicle per capita limit on energy use. I don't know how we're going to come up with it, but clearly then that would then feed into the transportation equation. I mean, none of that is a part of what we think about now in terms of how we approach transportation investment. We've got to internalize these external things, and the transportation community has typically been very hesitant to do that because they don't have control over it. And we've got to change that mentality.
And the good thing now is we have the recovery bill, which, as folks know, did have a major emphasis on transparency and accountability and reporting. So we're going to kind of have this experiment over the next weeks and months in a really short period, but to see how this comes together. And I think that We need to make sure that the transparency and accountability doesn't end once the recovery money is spent, but that we use that as kind of an experiment to see and then kind of correct for where we make mistakes, and the next authorization should build on that and shouldn't be a step backwards.
James Garner, an interested citizen from East Windsor. I'm going to follow up on the same question. I'm wondering if we have adequate models for evaluation in a period in which we're seeking to effect real change. Something that comes to mind might be the light rail from Trenton to Camden, New Jersey, which to me seems like a very good idea, very forward-looking, trying to develop a region, provide something, but the original data on outcomes haven't been so good so far. So I'm just wondering if we're trying to cluster people, the way change the way people live into clusters and things of that sort, do we really have established criteria that will enable us to do this readily? Thank you.
Let me start off with that. I think, frankly, the models we have were built in the 20th century, and I think they've worked well for parts of the 20th century, and I think we need to come up with some new paradigms, new models. Probably more importantly, we need to have a new attitude toward these things, because all the modeling in the world and all the thinking in the world, if it's in a closet with a lock on it, doesn't do us much good. So I do think we need to invest substantially in our models. We need to, frankly, talk a little bit about what Ann talked about, is get over the idea of stovepiping and think about what is the integrated solution, be it Camden to Trenton or in the case of where I live, the Maryland suburbs from Prince George's to Montgomery County is a thing called the Purple Line, light rail line, which would deal with the question when we built the Capital Beltway and the metro system, we assumed everything flowed to Nirvana in the central city, and we've now discovered, Lord, there's the suburbs, and we have no system that works very well for that. So we need to change those models.
And we need to make sure we're measuring the right things. The good thing about this conversation now just starting is that we can look internationally and see what's going on in other countries. And we've been learning a lot from European countries, such as the United Kingdom, that embarked on a major effort to use transportation as a way to improve the British economy. Not as a transportation end, but they wanted to improve the economy, and transportation was the lens they used to do that. And so they started looking back at the investments that they were making and trying to figure out how they were going to strengthen the core city of London, which is the economic engine for that country. What did they have to do to make sure that London was a functioning place and was able to keep the national economy humming? And everything kind of ran through that. Now, I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. I mean, they still make some stupid decisions, and politicians still do what they're going to do. But at least you had to stand up then and defend your actions in front of the light of all this evidence that was being assessed before that. So the good thing that they do in Europe that we don't do here is we measure things like carbon. Once you start measuring those kinds of impacts, small projects like bike improvements and pedestrian improvements, unclogging bottlenecks on the highway system, things that relieve greenhouse gas problems start to look much better, because now you're starting to measure the right things. We're just measuring transportation-related outputs, how much salt did you spread on the road. These are not the right things to get the economy moving.
I would just add one thought, that measures can't exist in a vacuum. We've got to know what the outcomes are that we're trying to achieve. And if we don't have that, measures really don't have any place to fit into an overall process of evaluating how well we're doing. So they're very closely tied together. We have to first get to the point where we're willing to have outcomes that relate to the larger issues that we're dealing with as a nation today. And then the measures, I think, become a lot easier to figure out.
We have one question here. And then.
Good morning. My name is Michael Cicero. I'm from the Casino Reinvestment Development Authority. This question is actually for Mr. Puentes. I was very interested to see in your presentation, you spoke about leveling the modal playing field and connecting transportation to housing and land use on a national level. And of course, I think that's a really great idea personally. But in light of the sedimentation of certain political interests in DC, like how do you make that a possibility, and how do you move forward in that direction? And on the state side, how can states respond to move that process along more efficiently?
That's a great question and a great observation. On the federal level, I mean, clearly, we're not talking about restructuring government. right? I mean, that's a waste of time, and something I just don't think you have the ability to do right now, even if you wanted to. But, I mean, there are clear connections that can be made. We know that the secretaries at HUD, at Energy, and Transport understand that what they do affects one another. And so I think the administration has been clear in sending signals that they're very interested in more of this integrated decision-making. So in terms of the administration. And I know we know in Congress there has been very positive reception to some of this integrated decision-making. Senator Dodd, as chairman of the Banking Committee, has talked about doing these kinds of things. Representative Olver is the chair of the Transportation and Housing Appropriations Subcommittee, and they've all started making noises in this direction. The one thing that I think is starting to get some traction is this idea of sustainability challenge grants, right, which is what we're calling a competitive grant, because some places simply aren't ready to start to do this. But there can be some solicitation that goes out for states, to answer your second question, for states and for metros to respond with what their best ideas are to move to this integrated decision-making. I think Jack is right. It's a big country. You're not going to be able to dictate a lot of this on the federal level, but through a little bit of federal money, you can incentivize this. The last administration had these awards for congestion relief and tolling and all that. We know the problems in the New York Metro with that, but it was a little bit of federal money that did seem to kind of incentivize some good thinking across the country. I think we need to take that same approach when it comes to this integrated thinking.
My name is Jeff Arch. I'm with Telvins.
With what?
There certainly has been no shortage of debates on this topic in the past 2 years, and I'm sure everyone would agree there'll be a continued fair amount of debate in the next year or so on this topic. But I want to ask a different type of question. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to peer into the future, into your crystal ball. This bill, the current legislation, expires September 30th. What will the new bill consist of? When will it come? And why will it turn out the way that you think it will? I just ask to speculate. It's a different type of question.
Next question. Well, let me try to take my shot at that. That's interesting. One of the great things about looking in the crystal ball is by the time the crystal ball actually becomes reality, nobody will remember what you said here. So this is probably good. But first of all, let me start with probably the more clear to me anyway on timing of the bill. We are at a crisis point in terms of the funding source for much of this Highway Trust Fund next year, just to give you an example. If we're on the revenue course we're on now, nothing changes. Basically, we'll be in a position where you can fund only 50% of the highway program that you could fund this year, about $21 billion versus about $42 billion. The next year, the transit program would drop from $10 billion to $5 billion and pretty much stay there. So we have a major revenue problem to cope with at the moment. And frankly, you can only go to the general fund. You may have noticed that things were coming out of the general fund pretty fast lately for a lot of things, and going to the general fund is probably not exactly a great option for a program that's supposed to have some dedication and control. So I think we've got to first and foremost figure out, do we have enough political courage in Washington to actually cope with the financial crisis that we have. Then, once we've got ourselves worked around to dealing with that, the timeline becomes clearer, because I don't think, first of all, I think it's, in spite of a lot of thinking in Washington, it's perfectly unrealistic to assume this thing is going to get passed on October 1, particularly with the information Ann mentioned about energy and the climate change bill coming along. That's probably, if that becomes the debate, will certainly tie this one up for a while. So I don't know where the end point is. It took us 2 years and 12 extensions to pass the last one, and I think we probably should have taken longer based on what we produced, but that's another story. You get away with this when you're outside of government. But nonetheless, I do think that certainly we'll spend the next year wrestling with this thing. I don't think we'll solve anything till we figure out how we're going to go about financing this process. And the last point, on just what it'll consist of, hopefully it'll look somewhat like what I outlined for you from not only AASHTO's perspective, you can find a lot of other organizations and people that have very similar thinking across the spectrum of objectives, including not only people like us that represent state DOTs, but people who who represent the environmental community, people like Brookings who represent, the thought processes, but I find a lot of consistency of thinking about what the elements ought to be. So that in and of itself bodes well for probably a much more effective and 21st century structured bill, and exactly what the pieces will be, I'm really not completely sure at this point.
Well, I would say, agreeing with Jack, it ain't going to make it by September 30th. I mean, that's, I would say, not going to happen, although some in Congress may disagree. But there's nobody in the administration, practically, at the DOT to work on this. And these other issues will clearly clog the calendar, so to speak. If we're going to achieve significant change and get beyond only a money conversation, the discussions about the importance and the role of transportation in our country at not only the national economic level but at our community levels has to ramp up a whole lot more in order to carry and build enough support to take the kind of steps that we're all alluding to. And I think we need some more time to have more of those conversations around the country. Otherwise, I would fear that we would be stuck pretty much in a lot of the same little boxes that we're in today. The members of Congress need to understand a great deal more, many of them, about this program, and that it's more than just a money machine for their congressional district or their state. If we're going to have the kind of change, and there's a huge need for better information and better stories for that audience in particular, but local elected officials, governors, and all need to come around to some different points of view about all of this. As I alluded to in my remarks, I think some of the key pieces, in addition to the funding, but as Rob said, only after we get some of these reforms in place, are the planning, the national goals and accountability, decision-making, and planning. And clearly we got to figure out the program structure. But those other items, to me, come ahead of the program structure, because we got to figure out what we're trying to do before we can even figure out what the program structure ought to be. So those are some areas where I think there's hopefully some opportunity for major change. But we'll see. Also, the leadership of the Congress is going to play a major role, and it's a little bit confused at the moment as well in terms of what direction it might take.
Questions?
Bob Bezick from Somerset County. One of the major things that I heard is this idea about creating a national vision, and I think Ann just touched upon that briefly. How do we actually accomplish that? I mean, this is a big country. There are a lot of competing regional interests. We already heard that energy and climate change sort of jumped ahead now, I think, of transportation, and I think largely because there's a clearer consensus on that issue. Yet we don't have that same kind of sense of urgency and consensus on transportation investments. So I'd be interested in hearing any of the panelists, their ideas on how to achieve that vision.
Let me start that, because interestingly enough, and I actually have an answer for that one, that a year ago last May, when work was being done to create input for the National Commission, there was actually kind of an unprecedented meeting of major groups representing the whole spectrum of transportation interests that gathered in Cambridge, Maryland, and actually produced a visioning document with a whole set of multiple elements that addressed all of the kind of relevant things that are important in these areas. And I was frankly amazed that you could bring that many diverse opinions and opinion leaders together and come out with a relatively concentric document that actually is useful. If any of you are interested in that, on the AASHTO website you can find the actual document, and it's written in relatively plain English and it's relatively understandable. So I think methodology-wise we know how to go about trying to do that. I think the real challenge for us is, as we take something like that, update it, shape it, what's changed? Well, a lot's changed economically, and a lot's changed on the priorities of the country, even in that period of time. So we probably need to take a process like that and actually try to update and reshape that activity.
I would suggest that the list should be short. because we need to make sure that there is broad agreement and consensus that it is truly a national level issue. Otherwise, we get into weeds and start getting into a conversation that is not going to lead to the outcomes that we want. So it clearly needs to reflect some aspects of the transportation world, the safety issue. I don't think there's much disagreement about that. As Jack said, the carnage is outrageous. Congestion in some way, there's some disagreement, I would say, among the various transportation communities about how you deal with and address that issue. But the energy and the climate issues, and some way to reflect the economic issues that Rob talks about, are critical for us as a nation as we go forward. And it is at that level that I think we need to focus what's the national interest and why we even have a transportation program at the national level. And, I welcome everybody into the discussion because we got to sort it out. But I think at the end of the day, it's got to be a fairly short list around which we can all rally.
That was generally what I was going to kind of say. But just very quickly, I think that it's important to understand, as Jack was mentioning, that there is a lot of consistency about 90% of the issues. There's 5% on the ends that's always going to be disagreement about. I think we need to make sure that we're not focusing on those fringe issues, and that these things that Ann had talked about, where there's general consensus. We've had 2 national commissions over the last year. We have an unprecedented reform movement that's been built up. We have the chamber. We have all kinds of folks that are generally saying the same things. And even though, again, we disagree about maybe some of the things in the end, everybody agrees the federal government needs to be present where they've been absent, needs to take leadership, needs to do something. And transportation is right for that, given the track record we've had in the last couple of years. So there's so much to start from. We don't need to do this from scratch. We need to build on what's been done, again, just in the last year and a half. A lot of folks are thinking about this. I think there's a lot of consistency.
Question over here.
Hi, Kyle Daniels, Master of Urban Planning student at Columbia University. I guess in response to something that Ms. Canby had said earlier about a single evaluation process, regardless of mode, I was wondering what the panel thought about the New Start's funding process as a model for that kind of single funding process, New Start's process being the main source of funding for federal funding for most public transit investments in recent decades.
I'll speak for my former colleagues, since Jack's not here, in the state transportation agencies. If they had to go through that, there would be an utmost revolution. So there is some hybrid between that process and what gets done on the highway side. And where do we put in rail? Where do we put in air? We have to figure out a different analytical framework based on the outcomes we're trying to achieve and what are the important issues that we need to look at. There's been some work in the UK that has provided maybe some food for thought in that arena. And there are other governments around the world that are thinking about this at a national level. But we have really balkanized this process. But I don't know that that's the one. There are pieces of it, surely, that probably make sense, but I don't know that that's the exact model.
You can understand why we got to this. I mean, it's the demand for transit investments is hyper competitive. The demand is not just coming from major metros in the Northeast, but it's coming from the fast-growing Sun Belt. It's coming from suburban mayors, from non-traditional, maybe kind of transit advocates. So the federal government needs to choose on where to spend its money, and to turn it into some kind of formula and just to send it out, probably wouldn't be the right approach. So having some kind of empiricism and measuring the quality of these proposals is probably the right approach. Clearly, there are problems, though, with the system, and it's not actually being executed correctly. Some say, I think, that the application process takes longer than actually building the thing once you get the money. So, I mean, something has to change. But again, it's the federal government being present where they aren't on the highway side. The U.S. Code states very specifically that the federal government shall not infringe upon the sovereignty of the states to choose highway projects. It's completely different from how we do on the transit side. So we need to fix New Starts. It needs to be reformed there, but that can't be all the reforms that we get. If that's all we get with reform, then we would have really missed the boat.
Hi, good morning. My name is Andrew Basold. I am a Master's in City Regional Planning candidate, May 2009, from the Blaustein School. You're mentioning that the surface transportation authorization needs to go through a different type of paradigm, different type of filter. Basically, you're looking to get rid of the transportation enhancement funding, I guess. We're talking about reevaluating how it gets done. My concern is that this has been a major source for bicycle and pedestrian enhancements for the past 15 years or so. I know that you're not looking to do away with funding, but it's something that really needs to be a focus, particularly if you're looking at different shifting, different funding mechanism for federal money, particularly considering that this past year, 27% of the fatalities in New Jersey roads were bicyclists and pedestrians. So I just want to bring that up as a comment more so than a question.
No, I totally agree. I think that this issue, when we say modality neutrality, which is such a great term, but we say that the big pushback we get is from the non-motorized community, because there has been a lot of attention, I think, to those issues lately, or more. And so we've seen funding increase, we've seen more attention, and frankly, they're concerned, the community is concerned that it wouldn't work out in their best interest. We totally understand that, because we haven't been measuring the right things. Again, this might be a little more pie in the sky, but in the UK, when they started measuring carbon, right, as one of the costs that come into this, and really making sure that that was part and parcel of these calculations, these bike and ped projects were at the top of the list. And the tagline for this Eddington report they did in the UK was that small is beautiful, and that they weren't going to build these gigantic projects, these big high-speed projects and things that were perhaps transformational, but were really, really expensive. They found so much more bang for the buck with these smaller projects. So I understand the decision-making and the concern, but if we get the system right, if we get the decision-making right, I have no doubt that these projects would flourish in the system. But the devil's in the details, you're right.
Joel Ettinger, New York Metropolitan Transportation Council. We're an MPO in the New York metropolitan area, and I would argue we do a pretty good job at multimodal planning within our boundaries. And I would argue most of the other MPOs do as well. But we're part of a much broader mega region, the Northeast Corridor. And I believe we do a lousy job at intermodal intercity transportation planning. Do you see the new legislation as an opportunity to create maybe a modified 3C process for intercity travel, especially for mega regions like ours?
Joel, I would hope that we can start thinking about the types of trips. Intercity trips are a very important component of the overall mix of transportation that goes on in this country, also within a region, and then at the local level. I mean, they're really sort of those three, and you could maybe put another one on the end of the international gateway aspect of it as well. We don't think about these trips in terms of what kind they are, and we don't have the institutional structure. So I would definitely hope that there is a process that we can put in place in this bill that would really enable the institutional structures and the decision-making processes for intercity travel, and that would even bring in the air side, because there's a whole bunch of, I'm listening to all the air congestion issues. Well, what happens if we look at the short-haul air trips and hook that up to the airports? I mean, STPP talked about that some years back, and it never went anywhere. But there's all sorts of connections that need to be getting thought about, for which we don't have the institutional structures now. We need to put in place something that facilitates that.
Stuart Lehman, Mercer County resident. Does the effect of transit choices and planning on land use need to be part of the national level discussion?
Go ahead.
Clearly, we have a deficiency. I think that even though there is this demand for transit investments, we know that most Americans don't have access to any alternatives. And last summer, when gas prices spiked at $4 a gallon, I think it started to draw a lot of attention to the role that transportation has in American household budgets. We know that it's the number 2 household expense for the average American households. Just housing is number 1, and transportation is about 20%, or 18, 19, 20 cents out of every dollar. So in some metropolitan areas, transportation is more than shelter. So those kinds of conversations start to get you down the road to thinking about these alternatives, because we know that when you look within metropolitan areas and where households spend the most on transportation, it is in these places where there aren't these alternatives. So the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago, Ann's colleagues, have mapped this out to a great degree. I would suggest you look at the stuff that they have done, really making the case that the more alternatives you have, when you start thinking about housing and transport together, you can really make a dent on household budgets. It's a very compelling message.
Ray Rosen, Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I'm a little bit disappointed because we were talking about new paradigms and new solutions. So the whole discussion has moved right back to federal solutions, which in theory would be nice, but they produce something like Amtrak, which serves the whole country, but is only economic and efficient on one route. So why aren't you pushing for legislation that would free up regional development so that New York and New Jersey could extend their relationships, maybe pick up the whole Northeast corridor, and you'll have super regions that produce their own solutions, which to me then would give you, you don't have 50 states producing solutions, but you now have several super regions coming up with solutions. Much easier to gain consensus because you're not worried about North Dakota in our part of Florida. So why not push for regionalism?
I think that this law may get us there to some degree because the various sources of revenue that are going to support transportation going forward, a number of them are not going to come to the federal level. If we expand tolling or if we expand value capture and other things, those are not going to be federal revenues. And so I think that we will definitely see, while we maintain a strong federal role for things that are clearly in the national interest, there will be hopefully a framework created in this bill that will foster much more innovation and entrepreneurism with public and private working together in these larger regions that won't be dependent on federal resources to do it. I mean, there is to some degree, I think because of the situation we have fallen into, there are people that I never would have expected to say, get the feds out, I don't need them anymore. They're just a pain in the neck. It's just a paperwork process and it's not giving me any value particularly. I can raise money more easily at home. That's sort of a dangerous way to be too. So I think there's overhaul of roles at a lot of different levels, and unless and until we can push it down some more of the responsibility, the gentleman's question about the land use issue, we can't ever deal with that, I don't think, at the national level. It's difficult enough at the state level. It's the regional level that's going to have to bring that together, and so we need to make sure we're putting institutions in place that will enable that to happen as well.
Unless there's a burning observation to make, I think we'll end here. So if you would just join with me in thanking our panelists.